Hannah, congratulations, Brandon will be moving into your house next week. Let's all celebrate. The clinking of glasses, my mother's radiant smile, and Brandon, my younger brother, was sitting comfortably at the head of the table, raising his glass as if he had just won a full scholarship to Harvard, when in reality, he had just claimed the lifelong dream I had worked for, right there at the Sunday dinner table, in the very home I grew up in. The three people I loved most had unanimously decided on something that would change my life without asking for my opinion even once. They didn't need to ask. They had already planned it all, and I was the last to know. An outsider. In my own family. I sat there, the wine in my glass suddenly tasteless. My heart pounded in my chest, not from emotion, but from shock. From anger, from the hot waves of humiliation rising up my throat. I am Hannah Caldwell, 32 years old, living in the southern suburbs of Portland, Oregon. A real estate professional is not the kind who wears business skirts, sips coffee, and calls that work. I once worked 2 jobs at the same time, and I skipped every summer vacation in my 20s to save up for my first home. And I did it. People used to praise me as the responsible child, the pride of the family. But that night, I realized I was just the girl with a spare empty room. Brandon is my younger brother, who is 2 years younger and has never been able to hold a job for more than 6 months. He once worked as a bartender, and he was fired for giving his friends free drinks. Once sold cell phones, got fired for missing inventory. Every failure of his came with the excuse of a toxic work environment. And every time, my parents rescued him. They paid off his credit card debt, bought him a new car, even helped him move out of his girlfriend's place after they broke up barely 3 months in. Me. When my car broke down on I-5 on a rainy night, my dad told me I should learn to take the bus. When I was losing sleep over paying for a damaged roof repair, my mom just sent me a heart emoji. But Brandon was different. He needed help. And this time, help meant moving into my house, rent-free, indefinitely. I looked at my mother, Marilyn Pierce, the same woman who taught me to be independent from a young age, now speaking to me in a tone sweet as syrup. Hannah, you have 3 bedrooms, and you're living alone. Sharing a little space won't hurt, will it? Your brother just lost his job, and his lease is almost up. Family is for getting through hard times together. Right. Honey. I bit my lip hard. My father, Stephen Caldwell, added, besides, it's not safe for a woman to live alone. Brandon can help you keep the house safe. Tend the yard. Tend the yard. The man who once let a cactus die because he forgot to water it, I turned to Brandon. He took a sip of wine, then shrugged. You're always working anyway. I being there just makes sure someone's home. I almost laughed out loud. No, this couldn't be real. This couldn't be the plan they had discussed beforehand. It couldn't be all 3 of them sitting here, popping champagne to celebrate my brother moving into my house as if it were some grand victory. And in that moment, amid the smell of roasted meat, the empty wine glass, and their fake smiles, I realized I was no longer the true owner of my own life. Only one question remained. What would I do to take it back? If you've ever been in a situation where your own family treated you like you didn't matter, if you've ever stayed silent just to keep the fake warmth of family intact, subscribe to Revenge Mark. There are stories you can't tell anyone. But here, we understand each other. After that dinner, I sat in my car for a long time, My hands still gripped the steering wheel, even though the engine was off. Outside, night had fully settled in. The early spring breeze slipped through the cracked window, but inside me was another kind of winter. Cold. Still. Aching. I didn't turn on the music. I didn't cry. There was only one question echoing in my head. Am I still part of this family? Or just a walking wallet? My mother's words were still crystal clear. Brandon needs a home. You have extra? Extra. I called that house my dream. My reward for 8 years without a lunch break, without a single day off. The place where I hung the diplomas I'd worked and paid for myself. Where I placed the first couch I ever bought. Where I watched the Sunday morning light spill through the kitchen window. It wasn't extra, but to them, it was just an empty room. The next morning, I couldn't get out of bed. Not because I was tired, but because I felt hollow. I lay there quietly in my own house, and for the first time felt like an intruder. Every wall seemed to whisper, soon. You won't belong here anymore. I tried to focus on work, calling clients, drafting contracts. But my mind kept drifting back to that night when they clinked glasses, laughing. While I sat there like an uninvited guest, Brandon, in his freshly pressed shirt, talked about moving in as if it were an opportunity he was graciously offering me. My father, the man who held my hand the day I moved into this house, said that a woman living alone isn't safe. It was as if Brandon's presence were some kind of shield. My mother, the woman who taught me how to lay the first bricks of my own life, called me selfish for not sharing an empty room. The deepest hurt didn't come from the words. It came from the quiet plotting behind my back. They had planned it. They had picked the date. They had opened the wine. They just forgot to ask me if I'm the homeowner. I started to wonder what was all my hard work for all those years working weekends, skipping parties, walking instead of taking an Uber, for what a house key was handed to my younger brother. A proclamation from my mother that night, as I was sorting through tax papers on my desk. My eyes stopped on a small wooden-framed photo me with my parents on graduation day. They were hugging me, smiling brightly. I was smiling too. But now, looking at it, that smile seemed so naive. Dad's strong daughter. You always make Mom proud. It all felt like a dream now. A dream I might have been the only one to believe was real. I wanted to call someone. But who? Every time I mentioned Brandon, my friends would say, "Come on, Hannah, he's your brother." Yes, my brother. But does being my brother give him the right to take over my home, my room, and live off me without even asking? I sat there alone in the dark, with only the faint click of the refrigerator in the background, and one thought slid in, slow as a blade. If I let this go, it won't just be a room. It will be my whole life being taken over. But then what? Where do I even start? When I'm the only one awake in a family that chooses to keep their eyes shut, I'm not someone who holds grudges for long. Over the years, I've learned to swallow the small stuff, to keep the peace, to make life easier. But this time was different. This time, I couldn't swallow it. Not because Brandon wanted to move into my house, but because they had already decided for me. They waited until dinner to announce it as if I were an employee getting my shift schedule from a boss, instead of the owner of my own life. I remember clearly that moment my mom placed her hand on my shoulder and said, "You should be more open-hearted. Your brother hasn't been as lucky as you." And then my dad added, Family is about sacrificing for one another. Hannah, I had planned to stay silent, like I always did. Silent when Brandon asked Mom and Dad for money for the 8th time. Silent when I found out Mom had paid his rent last month, but kept it from me. Silent when I saw Dad haul my old bicycle out of the garage to make room for the mini fridge Brandon wanted to borrow for a while. Silent for so long that even I could no longer hear my own voice. Tuesday morning, I was making coffee when I got a text from Brandon. Just one short line. Remember to clear out some stuff from your office? I'm starting to move things in on Saturday. No question mark. No. Is that okay? No asking for permission. I stared at the screen. My hand froze on the coffee press lid. And then I laughed. Not loud. Not joyful. More like a crack splitting open inside my soul. I used to think I was just being pushed out. But now I saw the truth I was never really in. That night, I stood in my office, the one Brandon called the empty room, and looked around bookshelves reaching the ceiling, the walnut desk I built with my own hands, paintings hung perfectly against the wall, and the warm yellow lamp casting light over the rug I had chosen so carefully. This room had been my refuge on winter nights, where I drank tea and planned the next day, and now it was about to become the bedroom of someone who valued nothing but his own ego. No, that couldn't happen. The thought flickered. Quiet. Small. But I knew. It wasn't born out of anger. It came from somewhere deeper. From fear. I feared that I was losing control of my own life. Fear that I was being reduced to the good sister. Fear that if I did nothing, my whole life would keep slipping away just like all the other things they'd taken while I stayed silent. I remembered what Sandra, my financial advisor, had told me a few months ago. Hannah, that house is eating up your entire budget. If something unexpected happened, do you have a plan B? Back then, I brushed it off. I didn't want to think about selling the home I'd worked so hard to build, but now, the unexpected had already arrived, and it hadn't come from the house. It had come from the people I called family. I opened my laptop. The screen lit up. The cursor blinked like an invisible finger tapping my shoulder. I typed the first line. Melissa, we need to talk. Urgently. It's about the house. I didn't know exactly where I was going, but I knew this. If they could make plans behind my back, then I could make plans for myself. I didn't speak. I didn't argue. I just started calculating. Melissa came to my house on Thursday evening, carrying her laptop and those sharp, familiar eyes. As a close colleague in the real estate business, she didn't need me to explain much. Just one look, one sigh, and she already understood where this was headed. Are you serious? Melissa looked up after scanning through the information about the house. About selling it. I asked back. I've never been more serious. I saw her expression change. No doubt, but respect. Maybe, for the first time in years, someone wasn't looking at me as the responsible sister or the good daughter, but as a woman reclaiming her own ground. We sat until late into the night, analyzing the market, comparing recent sales in the neighborhood, assessing the potential of the house. I once thought I'd keep it for the rest of my life. Melissa didn't say much, but she understood. Behind this decision weren't just a few numbers. It was a fracture in my heart that had gone far too long without being mended. If you price it smart and stage it well, she said, You could make more than what you put into it. I'm not looking for profit, I replied. I'm looking for freedom. The next day, I called Sandra, my financial advisor, and told her everything. No hiding, no dodging. Sandra was silent for a moment. Then she let out a breath, light as if she'd been waiting for this. I've been wondering when you'd finally step out of that good daughter mold you built for yourself. I smiled. A real smile. From that day on, I became a different version of myself. I started cleaning. Not the dusting and mopping kind, but clearing away the old things that no longer belonged to me. I took down the family photos hanging in the hallway, the ones of my parents' wedding, Brandon's 8th birthday, and my college graduation. I didn't throw them away. I carefully placed them in boxes, like storing away a past I no longer lived in. I changed the curtains, put a large mirror in the living room to catch the gentle morning light. I even moved the sofa for the first time since I'd moved in. No one but me knew. No one but me needed to know. I still went to work as usual, closed deals, called clients, exchanged polite smiles, but inside, something was shifting, like a small stream, blocked by rocks for years, suddenly finds a new path to flow, quiet, but powerful. One evening, I happened to see Brandon's post on social media moving this weekend, ready for the new chapter. Underneath was a photo of a suitcase on the floor with the caption, "Thanks, it's sis." I didn't like it. I didn't comment. I just looked at it and gave a small nod. They had made the decision for me. Now it was time for me to make mine. In the days that followed, Melissa and I worked closely pricing, photographing, writing up the listing, and preparing to put the house on the market. I hired a staging service, arranging every corner of the home as if playing a new role, one where I was no longer the burden-carrying sister, but a woman, stepping off the stage, and in that deliberate, chosen silence, I realized maybe I had never felt more powerful. The question was no longer, how do I stop Brandon from moving in, but could I leave before they even realized? They were no longer the ones calling the shots in my life. If you've ever been treated as the go-to solution for everyone else's problems, so much so that you're no longer asked, only informed, then this story is for you. Don't forget to subscribe to Revenge Mark, where we no longer have to swallow our anger in silence. Friday night, I called my parents. My mom's voice was bright and cheerful. "Finally, you decided to call Brandon's got all his things packed. I was just about to make pot roast for tomorrow's lunch, so you two can celebrate moving in." I didn't answer right away. Just a quiet breath through the receiver. "Hannah, are you still there?" "Mom," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could. "Tomorrow. I have a few things to take care of. I'll stop by for a bit. Don't cook anything too fancy." I hung up before she could ask anything else, because if I stayed on the line for even one more second, I was afraid I might cry, not because I was weak, but because I had once loved them that much. The next morning, I got up early, packed up the last of my things in the office, and then went outside to water the lavender patch along the side of the house one last time. Morning light streamed through the window, resting on the wall where I once hung my college diploma. Things I thought would always be there. 9:00 a.m. I put on a plain white button-up shirt, simple jeans, and hair tied back neatly. Nothing special to look at. But I knew today I was about to do something I could never take back. 10 Sedorf. I knocked on my parents' door. Brandon opened it, clean-shaven, hair neatly combed, coffee cup in hand like he was about to head into the office, not move into his sister's house without asking. "Right on time," he smirked. "And you're at the wrong house," I replied. Walking straight in, my mom came out from the kitchen, flour still on her hands. "Have you eaten yet? I'm making those orange rolls you love." "I didn't come to eat, Mom." I placed a brown envelope on the table, opened it. I pulled out the signed deposit agreement with both my signature and the signatures of the couple who bought the house. "I sold the house," I said slowly. Clearly, no one said a word for several seconds. No clinking spoons, no humming oven, just dry silence. My dad walked in from the backyard, looked at the papers, then at me. "You sold the house." "When?" "3 days ago. Contract signed. The buyers will take possession at the end of the month." Brandon blew up first. "What the hell did you do? I had everything ready." "You had everything ready." I laughed. "Ready to live in someone else's house without asking them." My mom was flustered. "You can't do this. At least you should have said something first." I looked her straight in the eye. "Like how you all told me in advance about your plan to have Brandon move in. I didn't need to shout, didn't need to cry. I just stood there with the clarity of someone who had finally taken control back into her own hands. It took me years to have that house, but I'm not going to let it become a battlefield for silence and unspoken sacrifices." Brandon stormed out. The door slammed behind him. My mom's breathing grew shallow. My dad still said nothing. I gathered the papers and slipped them into my bag, stood up. "I'll be moving out sooner. And I don't want to argue about it anymore." This wasn't revenge. It was a wake-up call. And for the first time, they couldn't predict my next move. Brandon didn't call. He didn't text. He didn't come back at all that afternoon. I knew he was furious. Not because he'd lost a place to stay, but because, for the first time ever, I had told him no. And Brandon, a man who had lived his whole life under privileges neatly arranged for him, was not used to hearing the word no. That evening, my mom called again. Her voice was hesitant. "Hannah, your dad's really worried. And I don't understand why you would choose to hurt your brother like that." I didn't answer right away. Because how do you explain to a mother who has spent over 20 years rescuing one child without realizing she's letting the other drown quietly in silence? "I didn't mean to hurt anyone, Mom. I just refused to keep carrying what was never mine to carry." 3 days later, I was in a meeting with a client when I got an email from the bank. Unusual activity detected in my secondary savings account. I couldn't remember ever giving access to anyone, except my dad. I opened the app. There was a transfer of $800 to an account under the name Hannah Caldwell. No heads up, no request, not even a short note. That same afternoon, I drove straight to my parents' house. On the way, my mind was spinning between anger, disappointment, and the return of an old ache, not having a voice in things that carried my own name. My dad was sitting on the porch. When he saw me, he stood up. "I'm sorry. Brandon said he needed the money urgently to put down a deposit on a new place. Your mom told me to transfer it from your secondary account. I thought you'd agree. You thought I cut in, or you knew I'd be upset but went ahead anyway." He went silent. His eyes dropped slightly, not remorseful, just tired. I glanced around. Brandon wasn't there. "I'm not a bank," I said, my voice hoarse. "And you and Mom can't keep using the word family as an excuse to cross my boundaries." That night, I locked every bit of access to my accounts. I moved all my money to another bank and opened a new account in my name only. I even revoked the emergency medical authorization my parents had from when I was still in school, not out of revenge, but because I had finally understood not everyone values what you give them. I thought it would end there. But then, Saturday afternoon, I got a call at work. "Hannah, what's going on?" "Someone just left an anonymous review on Yelp about your service. Very negative and very personal." I opened the site. The review was long, weaving in stories about being forced to sell a house, hurting family members, cold and heartless, all with very pointed implications. No signature, but the tone. I knew instantly. Brandon didn't attack me head on. He chose something dirtier, tarnishing my image in the one place where I was most proud of my work. I sat frozen in my chair. My heart is heavy. Not because I feared clients would misunderstand me, but because I realized something some people, when stripped of their privilege, will do everything they can to drag you down with them. The question was no longer, "Can I endure more of this?" It was, "Am I willing to fight to the end? Even if the enemy is the very person I once called my brother." I thought I would be furious when I saw that fake review, but I wasn't. The first thing I felt was emptiness. No tears, no cinematic burst of rage, just a blank space inside me. Once again, Brandon did exactly what he'd been doing his entire life, stirring up trouble and dodging responsibility. I sat alone in my office, staring at the words "cold, ruthless, abandoned her own brother" displayed right under my name, the real estate agent whose reputation I had spent nearly 10 years building. And then I clicked, "Report this review?" After that, I did nothing. I didn't call Brandon. I didn't text Mom. I didn't go on social media to explain myself. I did the one thing Brandon never expected me to do. I let the truth speak for itself. 3 days later, I got an email from Yelp. "This review has been removed for violating our community standards. We determined that it contains personal attacks unrelated to any service experience." At the same time, I got a message from Melissa. "The house has 2 couples bidding at the same time, both offering above asking. One of them just sent in an official offer 6% higher than list price." I looked at that email and my heart pounded. Not because of the money, but because, finally, the value I created was being recognized, not treated as something I was supposed to sacrifice. That evening, I came home. The warm yellow light glowed against the ceiling like it always did. But for the first time, I felt no regret. I walked past the old office, the former battleground, now empty. Everything is boxed up, exactly how I wanted it, space to start over. 2 days later, I got a text from an old coworker. "You okay? I saw that review disappear. Heard the higher-ups at the company caught wind of it and took your side. Seriously, who does that to their own sister?" I didn't reply. I just smiled. This wasn't a total victory, but it was the first win for the truth after so many years of my silence. I realized I didn't need to scream to be heard. I just had to stand firm, unshaken, until those who underestimated me were forced to take a hard look at who they were in this story. That weekend, I signed the papers to sell the house I once dreamed of living in for the rest of my life. Now, It was my ticket out of the role they had assigned me since childhood, the dependable big sister. I put pen to paper. Ink sank into the page. My hand didn't tremble. My chest didn't tighten. It was just lighter. I thought things had finally settled down. After the sale agreement was finalized, I began packing the last few boxes, cleaning out each drawer, taking down each memory. It wasn't as painful as I'd imagined. Just quiet. A stillness without voices, without anyone barging in, without anyone making demands. I had thought maybe this is the ending. But I forgot one thing. Someone who's been spoiled for too long never really knows when to stop. Monday morning, I was on my way to the company's new office when my phone rang. It was Sandra, my financial advisor. Hannah, do you have a moment to talk? This is a bit serious. My chest tightened. Serious has never been a pleasant word to hear at 8 a.m. Sandra spoke slowly, but without circling around it. There's been a lawsuit filed by Brandon. He's demanding a share of the money from the house sale. I almost laughed. What on what grounds? He claims he has a financial interest in the property because he contributed specifically by helping maintain the property and offering emotional support during the time you owned it. I was stunned. What Brandon? The man who never paid a single dime toward property taxes. The only contribution he ever made was asking me which room had the best sunlight for sleeping in. Sandra continued, her voice taking on a more serious tone. I know this is absurd, but if he's got a good lawyer and tells his one-sided story, this could drag on. And at the very least, it will affect the transfer process. I sat in my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight they ached. The lump in my throat was suffocating. Not because I feared losing the money, but because of the feeling of being betrayed all over again by my own blood. My parents called afterward. They had heard that Brandon was hurt, that he felt pushed out of the family, and that he only wanted to get justice. My mother cried over the phone. He has nowhere else to go. He just thinks, if you sold the house he was about to move into, then he should get a share. I couldn't believe my ears. Mom, I don't owe Brandon a roof over his head. I don't owe him a bedroom, and I certainly don't owe him a share of my life. That afternoon, I met with my lawyer. We went through every document from the moment I put down the deposit to the day I signed the contract, to the history of expenses. There was nothing with Brandon's name on it. No bills, no signatures, no trace of him other than his sense of entitlement. You have the advantage, but he could still slow down the process. And if the media or the buyer finds out, it could create psychological risk. I don't need anyone's sympathy, I said. I just need closure. That evening, I sat in the middle of my empty living room. No pictures on the wall, no rug, no familiar lamp, just me. And the feeling of being pulled back in, right when I thought I'd stepped out. Is leaving an old life ever really simple? Or must every woman who dares to stand up be prepared for the cruelest blowback? I used to think I was strong. I used to believe that as long as I walked with my back straight and kept my heart unyielding, everything would eventually fall into place. But that night, I sat on the floor of my empty house, and I couldn't breathe. No sofa, no rug, just the cold wooden floor and the pale yellow glow from the kitchen bulb that hadn't been removed yet. Every sound that echoed felt like it belonged to a stranger's house. And yet, it was still my home. Only now, I no longer felt like I belonged to it. The lawyer had done everything by the book. I knew that. But the bold black letters on the lawsuit notice still made my hands tremble. The plaintiff asserts that they contributed to the maintenance, upkeep, and emotional support of the owner, thereby establishing a partial interest in the property. I laughed, but the laugh never came out. It caught in my throat and turned into something that felt more like shame. I pictured the day in court. Brandon was standing there in a rented suit, wearing that blank expression, telling a story completely opposite to the truth. Mom was sitting in the back row, her eyes troubled. Dad, with his arms crossed, the way he always did when avoiding conflict, and me alone, facing the shadow of my own family. I started doubting everything. Had I gone too far? Should I have yielded if I had let Brandon stay? If I hadn't sold the house? Would things have been different? Those questions stabbed at the willpower I had been holding together for months. And then I thought of Mom. I had seen her cry over my brother, not because he was hurt, but because he didn't get his way. I remembered how she used to tell me, a strong woman is a blessing to the family. But when I finally became strong, I was seen as cold, ruthless. I sat in the dark, knees pulled to my chest, head resting on my knees, and for the first time since all this began, I cried. No one saw, no one heard, and I didn't even know exactly what I was crying for. All I knew was that everything inside me shattered at once. I wasn't afraid of Brandon. Not really. I was afraid that I had lost something I could never get back: trust. In the family, in fairness, and worse, in myself. Had I been wrong to stand up? Were there roles in life that, once you took them on, you were never allowed to set down? I closed my eyes, my back against the bare wall, and whispered the only thing my heart could manage. If this is rock bottom, then please, let me find a way to climb back up. Sometimes, all it takes is a message at the right moment, a word from the right person, and you can pull yourself out of the pit no one else can see. If you've ever stood in the middle of such darkness, subscribe to Revenge Mark, because no one should have to fight for their own justice alone. I don't remember when I drifted off to the floor. My back ached. My neck was stiff, and my wrists bore marks from clutching the pillow too tightly. But the first thing I felt the next morning was the gentlest touch. My phone buzzed. A text message from my dad. Are you okay? Your mom stayed up all night. Maybe we should talk. I stared at the words. My hands trembled. Not because I was moved, but because I didn't know if I could trust anyone anymore. I didn't reply right away. I got up, made myself a cup of coffee, washed my face, changed clothes. For the first time in days, I brushed my hair neatly, put on a pair of small earrings, not for anyone else, not to put on a show, but because I wanted to feel alive. And then I texted Dad back, if you really want to talk, it has to be just you and me. No Brandon, no one standing in between. He replied 10 minutes later, all right, this afternoon, 3 p.m., Maplewood Park. I arrived early. The park near my house was where Dad used to take me bike riding in the summer. There's an old wooden bench under the maple tree, the place where he once taught me subtraction by counting fallen acorns. My dad was already sitting there. No coffee, no papers, no face-to-face with lawyers, just a father, looking at his daughter as if he were truly seeing her for the first time. We talked. At first, it was small talk. Then, after a while, Dad looked at me, eyes slightly red. I didn't think things would go this far. I kept thinking that if I gave in, it would pass. But it seems, the more I gave in, the more I lost you. I sat silently, and for the first time, I didn't blame him. I was just tired. I've been trying to endure it, because I didn't want to lose my family. But then I realized I was slowly losing myself. Dad nodded. If I told you now that I'd stand by your side, would you believe me? I looked at him, didn't answer right away, but inside, something warmed, faintly, gently. That afternoon, Sandra called back. News from the court Brandon's side hadn't filed any additional documents. His lawyer had withdrawn from the case due to differences in approach. I was stunned. Not exactly a victory, but clearly, the cracks were starting to shift away from me. I sat by the window, watching the sunset slide down through the trees. The coffee in my hand had gone cold, but my heart somehow felt warmer than it had in days. No one had saved me, but I had found myself again, and that was what mattered most. I have never liked rushed endings. The more important something is, the more I want to slow it down, steady it, and handle it with care as if I were tying back together a fraying cord deep inside myself. After the meeting with Dad and after Sandra's call, I sat in my nearly empty kitchen and redrew the entire plan in my head. No more decisions born out of raw emotion. This would be a blueprint, deliberate and precise. I would leave 3 days before the official handover date. I would make sure Brandon never knew my new address. I would hand over the remainder of the process to Melissa and my attorney, everything from safeguarding my finances to blocking any leaks of information. I wasn't retreating. I was simply refusing to give them another chance to hurt me. The next morning, I went to the bank and completed the transfer paperwork from the sale of the house. Part of it would go into a long-term personal investment fund. The rest would be used to settle the final outstanding payments and place a deposit on my new home. I rented a small apartment with 2 bedrooms, just enough space and privacy, no luxury, no grand iron gates or swimming pool. But I chose it because the afternoon light in the kitchen was so warm. And because it only needed to be mine, I also went back to my old university, requested my transcripts, and applied for a course in asset management. Not because I needed a new degree, but because I wanted to learn how to manage my life with words and numbers, not just with tears. In the days that followed, I kept absolute silence with Brandon. He sent me 2 messages, one as long as a formal report, and one so short it felt icy. You were the last person I thought could ever turn your back on me. I didn't respond. Not out of contempt, but because silence, now, was the way I protected the peace I had fought so hard to reclaim. My parents stopped bringing up lawsuits. Mom didn't call as much as before, but every time she did, her voice no longer carried anger. It was simply tired. "Are you doing okay?" "I'm okay," I replied. "I'm learning to live life on my own terms." I knew there were still things they weren't saying. Maybe disappointment, maybe regret. But I no longer felt I had to explain myself, because I'm old enough now to know silence is no longer weakness. Sometimes it's a boundary. On my last night in the old house, I sat on the windowsill. The sky wasn't full of stars, but there was one quiet streak of light drifting across the horizon. I didn't make a wish. I just nodded gently, packed everything into my heart. Tomorrow, I will leave. But not to run away. To begin a new chapter. I would write myself. I left the old house on Friday morning, 2 days before the handover deadline. The pickup truck was parked in front. The hired driver helping me move asked, "Do you want to take one last look?" I shook my head. No need to look back. I had taken everything that still mattered to me, not in any cardboard box. That afternoon, while I was arranging my new apartment, my phone rang. It was Brandon. I almost ignored the call, but then I answered, partly out of curiosity, partly because it was time to stop avoiding him. His voice was calm, with a hint of coldness. "Can we meet, just meet? No mom, no dad. I want to end this, however it goes." We agreed on a cafe downtown, a place with just enough people so you wouldn't feel out of place, but not so noisy that it could cover the tremor in someone's voice. Brandon arrived first. His hair was cut shorter, his shirt neatly pressed, and his cologne was the same scent he'd worn since college. He looked up when I walked in, but didn't stand. I sat down. Didn't order anything. "What do you want?" I asked directly. "An explanation," Brandon replied, eyes unblinking. "I think I deserve to know why you chose to draw a line like I'm some stranger." I leaned back, keeping my tone even, "Because you didn't ask. You didn't get my permission. You decided on your own, as if that house belonged to both of us." "I thought that's what family meant," he said, his voice tight. "Family doesn't use familiarity as a license to invade someone's boundaries." I cut in. "Family, if it truly cares, doesn't take each other to court." Brandon's hands clenched. I never wanted it to get that far. I felt pushed out. Like everything you did was meant to teach me a lesson. "No," I said, meeting his gaze. "Everything I did was to teach myself that I have the right to choose not to be taken advantage of anymore." He fell silent. That silence lasted longer than I expected. "You think I haven't been hurt?" Brandon finally said, his voice low but clear. "When Mom and Dad praised you in front of me, when I could never hold down a job, and you just kept succeeding over and over again. I hadn't expected that, not because of the words themselves, but because of the way he said them. No raised voice, no defiance, just honesty." I blinked. For the first time, I didn't see Brandon as the demanding one anymore, but as someone who never learned how to stand on his own because the whole family had always propped him up. "So if I stop now, will you be able to stand," I asked, "without bitterness, without sarcasm?" Brandon looked up. That looks, I'd never seen it before. And I understood. This confrontation wasn't just about who owned a house. It was about the rights of two people who had been trapped in opposing roles for far too long to finally decide for themselves. I don't know what kept me sitting there after that question slipped out. "If I stop now, will you be able to stand on your own?" Brandon didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted, as if searching for something to hold on to in a room that was too bright, too real. I thought I would feel satisfied that, finally, the one who had always leaned on others would have to face the bare truth. But in that moment, all I felt was emptiness. "I was really angry with you," Brandon said, his voice hoarse. "I thought you were deliberately trying to embarrass me, trying to prove you were better so I'd have nothing left to cling to." I exhaled slowly. "No, Brandon, I have nothing left to prove. Everyone has always put me in that position, and I I've carried that weight for far too long just to keep that image intact. Then why sell the house? He asked, looking me straight in the eye. Because if I didn't, I would never escape the role they assigned to me. We both went silent. The server walked by, quietly set a glass of water on the table, then left, as if sensing the air was too tense to disturb. Brandon shook his head, a faint smile on his lips. Mom still says, "You always choose logic." No, you're wrong. I lifted my face. For nearly 30 years, I chose emotions. I chose silence because I didn't want to upset Mom and Dad. I chose to carry your burdens because I was afraid you'd collapse. I chose to stay because I thought family was something you never walked away from. And because I was so emotional, I got stuck in that cycle. But now, I smiled faintly. I'm finally living by reason. Brandon looked at me longer than he ever had before. I don't know how to start over. I nodded. Neither do I. It was the most honest answer I could give him. Because no one ever taught us how to start over when the place we thought was safest, our own family, was the very place that hurt us the most. Can you forgive me? Brandon asked, almost in a whisper. I swallowed hard, my hands tightening under the table. Not because I didn't want to forgive him, but because forgiving meant admitting that I had been hurt so deeply. Forgiveness isn't for today, I said, and maybe not even for tomorrow. But if you truly change, I'll see it. Brandon nodded. No reaction, no excuses. For the first time, there was no stubborn little brother. Just a man accepting the truth no one owed him anything. I left the cafe first. I didn't look back, because I knew at that moment that I didn't need anyone to walk with me. I only needed enough courage to make it all the way to the end. I didn't look back when I left the coffee shop, not out of contempt, not because I wanted to prove a point. It's just, if I turned around, I was afraid my resolve would weaken, and I couldn't allow that, not at this final stretch. 3 weeks later, the old house was officially handed over. I didn't go back to see it off, didn't take any photos for memory, didn't write a thank you post on social media. I only took a call from Melissa. They've received the keys. Everything went smoothly. They said their little girl really loves the swing you left in the yard. I smiled faintly. That swing was something I'd once planned to remove, but in the end, I left it there. There are things that, once they're no longer yours, you're finally ready to leave behind completely. Brandon disappeared from the radar for nearly a month. No texts, no calls. Then, one Thursday morning, Mom called. Her voice was softer, more tired. Your dad's fixing up the shed in the backyard. Brandon's helping repaint the whole thing. He also just got a job at a logistics company recently. I listened, not interrupting. He hasn't mentioned the past, but I think maybe he's starting to understand. Mom sighed. And you okay? I didn't answer right away. I stepped out onto the apartment balcony, looking down at the narrow street where the crimson-leaved trees were shedding for the season. My life had changed. Lighter, clearer, but also lonelier. I'm okay, Mom, but maybe I'll never go back to how I was before. I hung up, and inside, there was a quiet heaviness. I had done the right thing. I knew that. I had protected my boundaries, taken back the value that had been overlooked for so many years. I had made them see me differently, not as the accommodating sister or the enduring daughter. I had won. But what was the cost of fractured relationship? A memory now warped. A part of me, one that believed family was a place where you never had to be on guard, had died once. I didn't regret it, but I was tired. Not the kind of tired from fighting back. The kind that comes from having to prove yourself in the very place that was supposed to be home. That night, I sat down to write in my journal something I hadn't done in a long time. I wrote one line, then stopped. Forgiveness isn't the end. Forgiveness is how you keep from carrying the grudge into the road ahead. Maybe I'm still not ready to forgive completely, but I know I'm ready to keep living without being controlled by the hurt. And for me, right now, that's enough. 6 months later, on a quiet March morning, I stood in my new apartment, holding a warm cup of tea, looking out at the small courtyard blanketed in mist. No arguments, no lawsuit emails, no feeling of living in someone else's house, playing the role of a daughter, a sister, a stand-in for some nameless sacrifice. Just me, and the space I chose for myself. I still kept the habit of waking up early, just like in my old home. But instead of rushing to open my laptop, I now took a walk around the little apartment complex, greeting a few new neighbors and spending a few moments touching the tender branches where new leaves were budding. Life wasn't as tangled as before, but it wasn't perfect either. It was just ordinary, in a way that felt enough. Brandon and I still hadn't spoken again, but last week, I got an email from him, just one line. I'm studying supply chain management. Thanks for not letting me run away anymore. No signature, no emoji, but I knew it was the first time he wasn't saying something to get help, but to be acknowledged. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Forgiveness sometimes doesn't need words. It just means not letting that person live in your mind anymore, like a scratch that never heals. My parents had also started to change. Recently, my mother sent me an article about financially independent women, along with a short note, "You've always been ahead of your time." I read it and smiled, not a smug smile, but a grateful one. Grateful that I hadn't given up halfway. I was still working as a real estate agent, but I no longer took every contract. I chose my clients, chose my hours, chose exactly what served the life I wanted to nurture, not to prove how good I was. I also started writing again, not for publishing. I just want to distill feelings I once thought could never be put into words. Like today, I closed my laptop, stepped out onto the balcony, took a deep breath. The wind carried the scent of damp pine wood and a faint whiff of coffee from the cafe downstairs. Peace. A kind of peace I once thought I'd have to sacrifice everything to get. Turns out, I didn't. I just had to let go at the right time. I used to think revenge was the only way to feel alive again. But then I realized forgiveness isn't for others. It's the last gift you give yourself, so you don't carry the fire for the rest of your life. And when I closed the door to my apartment behind me, I knew not everyone will understand what I've been through, but I do. And now, I'm strong enough to move forward, not carrying, not shrinking, not retreating, just calmly walking toward myself. Some stories don't need a grand finale, just an ending that leaves the heart quietly still. Hannah didn't need to beat anyone. She just needed to conquer the fear of not being seen and then learn to move forward as someone who truly knows her own worth. If you've ever been underestimated, ever sacrificed in silence, or ever walked away from the place called family just to keep yourself intact, then this story is for you. Leave a comment if you've ever gone through something like Hannah. Share this video with those who are learning to stand up for themselves. And don't forget to subscribe to Revenge Mark, where stories are told with all heart and a truth that never turns away. You are not alone in this journey. We are moving forward together